Good evening, everyone. I would ask that you would please rise as Pastor Jim Johnson of Calvary Free Church leads us in our invocation, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thanks for the benefits of living in a great city like Fergus Falls. And Lord, I thank you for our city council, for all of the employees and staff, for our mayor. Lord, I pray for your blessing on each one. Lord, as they constantly have to deal with issues that are important and sometimes controversial, pray that you would give wisdom. And Lord, we pray that you would help them as they deal with people to be able to recognize the value of each individual person as a person that's been created by you. And Lord, we pray that you would help all of the people of Fergus Falls to act in love towards one another as you have loved us. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
It's Monday, May 6, 2019. I will call this meeting of the Fergus Falls City Council to order. Roll call, please.
Here.
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 Here. We have a quorum. The first item on the agenda this evening is the approval of the agenda, and I will call on our city administrator, Andrew Brumsack.
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. Members, good evening. A few minor things this evening. We've had a request to remove items 13 and 14 from the consent agenda, so we will take those up immediately upon approval of the consent agenda. And then also just to note, item number 3 under ordinances and resolutions, the original agenda talked about a resolution. It's actually going to be a motion directing the city attorney to draft that proposed ordinance. So it's not a resolution, it's a motion directing the city attorney.
Which one's that?
Number 3 under ordinances and resolutions.
Got it. Are there any other additions or corrections to the agenda? If none, I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda as amended.
I'll offer that.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you, Jim. All in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That motion carries. There are no public hearings or bids to award this evening. Under petitions and communications, tonight we have a resolution acknowledging the retirement and 34 years of service from Robert Schultz. And I will read that resolution. Whereas Bob Schultz has submitted his intent to retire effective May 10th, 2019, and whereas Goob began his employment with the city of Fergus Falls on September 3rd, 1985 as a refuse carrier, and whereas he moved into the position of a refuse collector driver on June 15th, 1989, and whereas on August 16th, 1999, he began a position as light equipment operator. And whereas on May 1st, 2014, he returned to his position as a refuse truck driver and has remained in this position until the present time. Now therefore be it resolved by the City Council of the City of Fergus Falls, Minnesota, to accept Bob Schultz's resignation and thank him for his 34 years of dedicated service to the City of Fergus Falls. The above and foregoing resolution was offered at a regular council meeting of the City Council held on May 6, 2019 by Councilmember Jim Fish, who moved its adoption and was seconded by Councilmember Scott Kwame and was adopted by the following vote. Roll call, please.
Thompson.
Yes.
Arneson.
Yes.
Jefferson.
Yes.
Hicks.
Yes.
Fish.
With regrets, yes.
Bickford.
Yes.
Plummer.
Yes. Yes.
That resolution is approved. Thank you, Bob.
Enjoy retirement.
What's that? I'll be there Friday. It's a great 34 years, honestly, it has.
Thanks, Bob.
Take you over your chair one of these days.
I'm moving.
Thank you. All right. Under the consent agenda, as Andrew mentioned, we are going to remove items 13 and 14. There's a copy in your packet. Lynn's also put one on the board for us. Are there any other items that anyone wants to discuss independently? If not, I would entertain a resolution approving the consent agenda minus items 13 and 14. Thank you, Brent.
I'll second, Your Honor.
Thank you, Justin. Roll call, please.
Thompson.
Yes.
Armisen.
Yes.
Gustafson.
Yes.
Hicks.
Yes.
Fish.
Yes.
Hayford.
Yes.
Klein.
Yes.
Hooper.
Yes.
That resolution is approved. Item number 13 is a motion directing the city attorney to make amendments to ordinance 83 7th Series City Code Chapter 10 dealing with construction. Scott, did you have a question regarding that item?
There's probably some overlap between these both 13 and 14, and then what's coming up as the first reading on, under ordinances, resolutions on this same ordinance 83. But basically, as I understand it, this has to do with the building code that applies to anybody doing any kind of construction work, any kind of electrical improvements or new construction, any kind of plumbing or repairs or installations, that kind of thing. And the thing that I would like to get a little clarity on, and the reason I wanted to talk about it a bit, is the ordinance doesn't specifically say, you know, what an owner can or cannot do on their own property, other than they're required to get a permit. And I understand the need for getting a permit and the need for inspections and those kinds of things. But as you look at the various segments, whether it's under the building part for structure, or the electrical, or the plumbing, some of the sections seem to have more detail about what's required and what's not, what the penalties are and what's not. And it just, I would have expected it to be more uniform in how the ordinance is written. For example, one area of electrical, if you don't follow the rules, it's a misdemeanor and you can go to jail. No such penalty was spelled out in the plumbing section. I thought it would be good to just understand that a little better, if we could.
Certainly.
Sure, well, sure. Relating to the variations of the plumbing code and the electrical code, it may have been my omission, but I mean, I certainly would be happy to include a paragraph very similar that is contained within the electrical code. The enforcement provision, unfortunately, one of the ways that we can enforce ordinances is through the criminal system. And so in order to do so, you must have some type of penalty clause within the ordinance to say that this is a misdemeanor. Now, city councils are authorized to pass laws that have criminal sanctions. And generally, if you look at the end of our city code, there's a catch-all under that, the last section that's in there, that basically says is that any violations within the entire city code are city misdemeanors. But I'm happy to include the very similar language for the violation provision of the electrical code and include that into the plumbing code. I think it makes sense to have them say the same thing, in essence. And so I would be happy to include that in the next version that you would see when this comes back. I know we talked just briefly, and you wanted some clarification about what private citizens could do and could not do. I'll talk with our Public Works Director about state language that evidently, it's my understanding, is that under the state plumbing code, for instance, certain routine repairs such as a leaky faucet and the like, and I might just turn to Mr. Taylor to kind of explain that. There are some provisions that state law permits without a plumbing license.
Yeah.
And we could probably incorporate similar language for the permit process for the plumbing permit. But Len, would you mind discussing that a little bit?
Yep, the state plumbing code does allow for a homeowner that's residing in a given property to do their own plumbing work.
But that's the catch, they have to own it and they have to reside there. So, but that is a provision in the state plumbing code.
And we can certainly incorporate,
Does that have to be inspected then?
Yes, it still does need a permit and inspection,
Just like the electrical then?
yes,
Because you can do the same thing with the electrical.
correct.
yeah. I mean, we can incorporate language into the plumbing code to make that clear, that a homeowner is able to provide their own plumbing services, provided they live there, and it's hold the necessary permit, and that'd be inspected.
I think it would also apply on the other mechanicals, HVAC, even the structural stuff, as far as that goes. And then, those were the two areas that I saw the clearest distinctions, but I just thought it would be good to see how that was uniformly treated across the trades.
Sure, and I don't know the answer to the question of dealing with gas.
Yeah, it actually doesn't apply to the gas lines. We,
But a guy could put in his own ductwork or
ductwork, yeah.
that kind of thing.
Gas line has to be installed by a licensed installer.
Okay. That's the clarity, I guess, that I would like to find written, so it's real easy for someone to understand.
Sure, and so what I would suggest is that you offer the motion to instruct me to draft such a document, and to, we'll produce that at the next council meeting. But if you want to offer the first reading with that to keep the process moving, and we'll include that at the second reading, which would be in 2 weeks. And if we wanted to, if it's acceptable, then we can authorize it. If it's not, we can go back to the drawing board.
With the understanding that Ralph has presented, I'd like to make that motion. And as he said, this is the first reading, and in my discussion earlier with Andrew, we're not under any deadline with this where it has to be adopted by the end of the month or anything like that. So if it does take a couple of revisions before we get through what we're looking at, I think that that would be helpful. So I'll offer that motion, please.
Thank you, Scott. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Jim. Any further discussion? All in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That motion carries. Does the same hold true for 14 then, Scott?
Yes.
No. Would you be willing to offer that as well?
Yes.
The resolution?
You're on it. Oh. I mean, I don't know whether you can do that if you, because it says resolution approving a summary publication of the ordinance. Obviously, if Rolf's going to make some changes.
To the second reading. So we're going to have a summary, we're going to approve the summary, then we'll have a first reading, then he'll bring back 2 weeks from tonight.
Do we need to kind of change the language?
No,
Okay.
not with the resolution approving a summary publication. That's just to shorten the publication length that's put in the newspaper
Right.
after the ordinance is in effect. So this is really a resolution that's just authorizing the publication of a summary.
Something in the future?
In the future.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, thank you.
And it only applies once the ordinance becomes once the ordinance is past its second reading.
Okay, thank you.
Need a second to
I'll
that
second it,
resolution?
yeah.
Thank you, Anthony. Any further discussion on that? Roll call, please.
Yes.
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 That resolution is approved. Under ordinances and resolutions, now we have the actual first reading of that same ordinance 83-7 series amending City Code Chapter 10, construction, and we just need someone to introduce that tonight.
I'll introduce that, Your Honor.
Thank you, Justin. Item number 2 is a tax increment assignment for Sunset Ridge Apartments. I'll call on our Finance Director, Bill Sonmore. Good evening, Bill.
Good evening. Thank you, Your Honor. In your packet, you have a memo and an agreement. It's an assignment and assumption of development agreement and TIF note. So we've certainly heard of these before. This is a different one now. It's for the buildings that are out on Pioneer Road, that new street that's been put in. 3 buildings, 105 units, and the current owners of that, the name of the buildings are Sunset Ridge Apartments, LLLP. They are looking to sell that to Campbell Properties LLC, and they are the people that own the Somerset Apartments over by the YMCA. So we've had experience with both groups here, and very positive experience. So no issues. I checked with our building department if we had any issues with either one of these, and we have not. So it's been a positive experience with them. So they are simply just performing a sale. of this. But before a TIF note can be transferred, the city council needs to approve of assigning that development agreement and the corresponding TIF note. This original development agreement was entered into on March 14th, 2014. The principal amount of the TIF note was $1,193,476, and that pays no interest. That's a 0% interest rate. Goes through the year, I've got it on here, 2030. So that note will expire on December 31st, 2030, or if it's paid off sooner than that, because the tax increment generated varies a little every year. So, but the latest it would go is 2030. So, looking for you to approve this assignment and assumption of development agreement. It was drafted by our bond attorney from Briggs & Morgan and working with the attorney for Sunset Ridge Apartments.
Thank you, Bill, and we would do that by resolution.
Correct.
I'll offer that.
Thank you, Krista.
Second that, Your Honor.
Thank you, Tom. Are there questions for Bill?
Bill, this Campbell Properties also owns the next property to the north of those three buildings out there, is that correct?
You're right, thank you. Yep, they did. They purchased that as well. Is that the
Like
Red
a couple
River?
months ago? Yeah.
Yep, they purchased those as well. So,
They've
which the current development group of Sunset Ridge, they said they often build them and then they sell them off, and Campbell Properties being one of those that they sell off to, so.
Thank you, Scott. Any other questions? Roll call, please.
Thompson.
Yes.
Arneson.
Yes.
Gustafson.
Yes.
Hicks.
Yes.
Fish.
Yes.
Hagberg.
Yes.
Tony.
Yes.
Hoover.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That resolution is approved. Item number 3 is a motion directing the city attorney to draft a proposed ordinance to amend the zoning map from RA to R4 for the development of a multifamily housing at 1406 and 1412 West Alcott, as requested by Platt Properties, LLC, on behalf of Platt Properties, and Douglas and Nancy Hanson. I'll call on our city administrator, Andrew Bremsett.
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. Members, Platt Properties LLC is proposing to rezone the two properties that the mayor just mentioned. They're currently in agricultural residence, which is our RA zone, and that's our holding zone, so to speak. This property was annexed recently, and all properties that are annexed by the city go into RA as a holding zone per city ordinance. They're looking to rezone it from RA to R4, which is multifamily residence. The proposed use is a phased development plan, including a combination of multifamily housing such as apartments, townhomes, duplexes, that are similar to their existing River Oaks Landing project northwest of this site. They are the people who constructed that large project on the south side of the river here, 2016, 2017. I will say this, the multifamily has been contemplated for this area of the city, and the subject property in question was designated as R4 on the 2030 future zoning map, so it is in line with our future land use and zoning map. The Planning Commission heard this item at their meeting last Monday. They held a public hearing, and on a 5-2 vote, they recommended approval of this rezoning request. So there was all kinds of supporting information within your packets this evening. Letters were mailed to property owners within 350 feet, and staff is recommending approval of this rezoning. I should also mention, Your Honor, members, that there's future steps to the development of this property, including design review by the Planning Commission and the City Council, which will also have a public hearing. So there will be an opportunity for the public beyond this rezoning phase, if this were to move forward, to comment and weigh in on what they're proposing as a use when they hammer that down. At this point, everything is in conversation stage. If the rezoning were to take place, they're going to invest in putting together a site plan and going into more of those details, at which time would then come back before the Planning Commission and also the City Council.
Thank you, Andrew. Is there someone like to offer that motion?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Brent. Discussion? Questions? Yes, Scott.
I'd like to offer my support for this. I think that the developer, in this case Gary Thompson's, done nothing but wonderful work, and I think we need to support those guys that are doing a good job in town. And I'd really like to see a strong show of support for this project and for this rezoning to make it happen.
Thanks, Scott. Any other comments, questions? All in favor of that motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That motion carries. Item number I is a presentation of claims tonight. We have claims in the amount of $1,052,530.17. And if there's any questions, I would direct them to our Finance Director, Bill Sonmore. Seeing none, I would entertain a resolution.
Someone that wants to comment on the last item.
You just passed.
Does the public not get a chance to speak about the properties or?
Your Honor, members, I would just reiterate that there was a public hearing held last Monday before the Planning Commission, which is required. This was not necessarily a public hearing. You could recognize people from the audience, Mayor, if you choose to, but there's no requirement that you allow the public an opportunity to speak.
It's my understanding that, along with what Andrew said, that as part of this rezoning process, there will be a chance for the public to comment on a particular project that goes forward. If anyone has any comments specific to the zoning, I guess we could entertain the zoning, but if we could, let's keep it to the zoning tonight, and then if any future projects that are discussed, we'll have everyone have the opportunity to discuss that. So if you had any particular comments, I would allow anyone to talk specifically about the zoning if you had a comment on that.
I would like to.
Certainly.
I was at the Planning Commission meeting 2 weeks ago and understood from that meeting that we would get an opportunity to speak here today. So I did have a few prepared comments. So I appreciate the opportunity to raise those comments.
Yeah, please, just for the record, go ahead, please state your name and your address.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you.
So good evening, City Council members. My name is Tanya K. Kelm, and I live at 1121 West Side Drive, which is a property directly adjacent to the northernmost lot that's being considered here tonight for rezoning. At the Planning Commission meeting on April 22nd, the individual zoning distinctions needed to be reviewed for the sitting Planning Commission members. In that same spirit, I would like to briefly comment on Chapter 7 of the City Charter, Paragraph 710 of the zoning and subdividing, which details the RA, or Agricultural Residence District, and reads in part from page 13. The purpose of the RA Agricultural Residential District is intended to provide a district which will allow for extensive areas of the community to be retained in a rural use in advance of the needs for these lands for urban purposes. It seems to be disconnected from this idea that it's a holding ground for this particular reading of the charter. Under Article B, the permitted uses are single-family detached dwellings, agricultural land uses, nurseries, parks, recreational areas, etc. From this language, I think it should be understood that the original zoning was not arbitrary or capricious. In that same original intent, the parcels of land being discussed have been in their current state since the development of the neighborhood. The neighborhood has been established since the mid-90s, and precedence over the zoning and use of the land is over 20 years old. The economic viability of RA, or R1. The southernmost plot of land being discussed was purchased by plat properties under the knowledge of the R1 zoning. The developers were not forced to purchase the property and should not have done so if they were not comfortable with those requirements. The conditions for development of the property has not changed in the short time since that sale was made. In addition, by proposing the sale of the northernmost property as contingent on the rezoning by the city to R4 status, this implicates the city to the allowance of all of the implications of that zone under the law. At the Planning Commission, it was discussed that we would have multiple opportunities to discuss our concerns with this type of a building plan for which we haven't seen. But what I'm also hearing is that once it's zoned to R4, if they come back with a plan that meets that zoning requirement, how can you say no? Can you legally say no if it meets the zoning requirements of Zone 4? Can you disagree with a building plan that's brought forward? These are questions that I have. Since this property is directly adjacent to mine, I find that the plot map on the county website does little to show the concerns of the impact that that rezoning could have on its neighbors. I've brought along a few pictures. Under the current 4 zoning, front yard regulations are 30 feet. Side yard regulations are 15. I've marked off 30 feet from my property line and taken pictures for your consideration. As well, I've marked off and taken pictures of 30 feet of distance from the existing River Oaks property. These clearly show the cause of concern that our zoning would have on neighborhood properties, and some of the items of concern that I have yet to address. So the first picture that I'd like to show you is the property line that runs north and south between my property and this property that's directly adjacent to me to the west that we're discussing tonight. You can clearly see the west edge of my property, which would be my dining room, my master suite, and a deck out the back. This split rail fencing is the property line. The evergreen tree that you can see to the left of the picture is on my property, as well as the forsythia that's blooming. I've taped out 30 feet, and this particular evergreen in the foreground is on the property that we're discussing, and 30 feet is marked out by the person in the photograph. That's 30 feet. For perspective, this is 30 feet from a 3-story apartment building in an R1 neighborhood. So perspective isn't exactly equal, but imagine having that 30 feet from your property line. It's massive. It's beautiful, but it's massive, and it's outside of the original intent of the zoning. Again, this is 30 feet from the existing property that they own. This is not 30 feet, this is over 30 feet. But you can see that while these pictures were the 3-story development, when you consider the tuck under garage that they have on their existing building, this could be 30 feet from property lines. It's huge. It dwarfs the existing neighborhood development. This is 30 feet from their front yard, or from their front entrance. I couldn't get the extent of the building in the frame. I couldn't get back far enough. That's 30 feet. Again, side yards could be 15. Again, it's a beautiful property. Would you want that 30 feet from your bedroom window? 30 feet. The current stand of trees filter much of the natural lighting during a large portion of the day that exists on that northernmost property. A building of this size could amount to 4 stories high if you take into consideration the underground parking, and if it was built on the current level ground on that northern end. That would completely block all natural lighting. And so from the backyard, you can see that most of the residential areas that are in my neighborhood directly to the east of me have walkout basements. So our whole backyards are yet another story below what could be a 4-story building. You can see my property line here, and again, I've taped off 30 feet from the figure. Picture of the existing backyards to the east. And I'll pass these around. Increased light pollution is a concern. This is a residential single-family home area. This has largely been rural, agricultural. A parcel of this size rezoned to an R4 would significantly increase the amount of unnatural light forced on its residents. Between the house lighting, that would be code, and parking lot lighting. Hard surface runoff. The properties currently have less than 3,200 square feet of hard surfaces. If the developer were to build something similar to River Oaks, which only comprises 24 units, that number could increase 6-fold. And this does nothing to understand how many units that they could actually put in under R4 rating. Back of the envelope calculations at the Planning Commission meeting was that they could put 69 units in that parcel. That means 30 units facing the backside of our neighborhood potentially. Spot zoning, rezoning a portion of the neighborhood from R1 and RA to R4 status could be interpreted as spot zoning. It's in contrast to the charter's planned and orderly progress of neighborhood development. Adjacent benefits, there's no foreseeable benefit to adjacent landowners. The benefit is purely to the developer. A lack of vested interest, the developer is not planning on building a home for themselves. They are unlikely to live in the neighborhood. Their interest is purely economic, and when they have finished building up a higher density neighborhood, they can move on. They won't have to deal with the issues laid out here that the adjacent homeowners will deal with on a continuing basis, day and night. R4 availability, there are other parcels of land for which the developer can use. Holding the city responsible for an impending sale on the northernmost plot only further commits the city to accept their building plan, which could include up to 69 units. Furthermore, the developer has already purchased land in advance of this determination of R1 and R3. If the city council feels R4 is needed, other parcels of land could be used for this purpose without rezoning an existing neighborhood. Density at the planning commissioning meeting, it was roughly determined that continuing the neighborhood's R1 status could mean that up to 25 homes could be built in that area. Again, changing the status more than doubles that amount. It's simply outside of the scope of the precedent that the neighborhood community has stated in Chapter 7 of the city charter. Since neither the Planning Commission or the City Council can place any restriction on the rezoning, the developer has carte blanche. The condition of sale is contingent on the rezoning, and the city implicates itself to the zoning codes. Again, 30-foot front yard, 15-foot side yards, and up to 69 units. Despite the developer's insistence that they would not build anything with which the neighborhood or community wouldn't be happy, the first notice of the proposed development was delivered to my mailbox on April 15th, with the Planning Commission meeting following on April 22nd. That's 7 days, 5 business days, with which to submit a letter, get together your facts and information. No contact for further follow-up has been made by the developer to alleviate questions or concerns. The developer insists that they have no building plans that they can share with the city nor with the neighbors. But with a current investment of over $2.5 million in the River Oaks Landing, no curbing at the end of their existing driveway that leads directly to these properties that we are discussing here tonight, the developer's currently owned property directly adjacent to the plots being discussed, it's difficult to believe that they are being genuine with this information. It appears disingenuous to me at best. Dissent was recorded by both neighbors present and some of the currently sitting Planning Commission members in attendance at the April 22nd meeting. While I am not against development of the property, I am against unchecked development to the high density level of R4. It's second in line to the highest density development that the city can offer a developer. In consideration of Chapter 7 of the City Charter, paragraphs 710 and 711, the foresight of the City Council's determination of the property's current zone rating and the neighborhood's long history of low-density development in the neighborhood, the lack of a building plan, and the city's inability to require one in advance of the zoning change, or to include any restriction on the rezoning, a lack of transparency on the developer's part, the neighborhood dissent, I respectfully request that the City Council deny the request for rezoning of this property to the second highest density rating of R4. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew, did you?
I just want to say one thing, Your Honor, members. Referring to Chapter 7 of the City Code, Section B, subsection D, it's titled Future Annexation. It says, any land annexed to the city in the future shall be placed in the RA Agricultural District until placed in another district by action of the council after recommendation of the City Planning Commission. That is what's before you this evening. That property was placed in RA because it was recently annexed. That's how that zone determination was made. You guys are taking action based on the recommendation of the City Planning Commission on a 5-2 vote last week to change the zoning of this parcel from RA to R4. Just wanted to clarify that procedurally so we're not misleading anybody. That's verbatim out of the city code. I won't speak to the merits or any of the arguments that she made. I think she's entitled to those opinions.
Thank you. All right, so moving on, item I. Sure, but we are gonna keep, Pat, you're welcome to come.
I'll make it short,
make-
sweet, and simple.
Sure, because we,
Because I'm a long-winded, but I'll be nice tonight.
nope, certainly, I want to give people a chance to speak.
Thank you. My name is Pat Schultz. I live at 1143 Parkview Drive. I have one simple question for everybody that sits back here. Would you want this in your backyard? Would you want this in your side yard? And I think, Jim, it wouldn't happen with you, but the rest of you, no. I can honestly say you wouldn't want that there. And I've come loaded, but the stuff I've got is for a future meeting.
Sure.
I just like to say, just think about that for a while. And secondly, I'd like to thank Tanya. Wow, was she prepared. It's one of the better presentations I've ever heard here, so.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Tanya. Item I is a presentation of claims. I don't believe we had a resolution offered on this. Okay, so presentation of claims this evening in the amount of $1,052,530.17. And if there's any questions, we will direct them to our finance director. And if there are none, we would entertain a resolution.
I'll make that, Your Honor.
Thank you. Anthony?
I can second that.
Thank you, Caroline. Any questions for Bill? Roll call, please.
Thompson.
Yes.
Ernstson.
Yes.
Yes.
Hicks.
Yes.
Fish.
Yes.
Hager.
Yes.
Bauman.
Yes.
Rupert.
Yes.
That resolution is approved. There are no board, committee, or department reports. There are no reports from staff or administrative officers. There is no old or unfinished business that I'm aware of. Under new business, we have 2 items. The first is a request. Didn't see you there, RC. First is a request for a book sponsorship, and I will call on Mr. RC Drews.
Thank you, Your Honor, members of the council and city staff. If you don't mind, I have a handout that we didn't get to the city in time for this meeting, but it provides just a little bit of background to the
Please.
council on this project. Thank you. I do have one to spare if you would like one, sir. So good evening, council. Good evening, Your Honor. Pleased to present this evening. Pleased to have this opportunity to speak before you. As an introduction, for those that don't know me, my name is RC Drews, and since 2016, I've operated a professional writing services out of Fergus Falls called RC Writeswell. I'm here in that capacity, but also representing the Otter Tail County Historical Society, along with their director, Chris Scholke, who is here this evening as well. And we want to speak regarding an exciting project for the preservation of local history, something that we believe City Hall may be interested in being a partner on. And so a little bit of background on that. In mid-2018, the idea was brewing for a local history, something that shared with our residents, with our area, the story of Fergus Falls. And it largely came from projects I was working on with other clients at the time. I'm 5th generation Fergus Falls myself, and in studying these other projects, I came to realize how much of this city's history I was ignorant of, and how remarkable the city's history is. And so in mid-last year, I approached Mr. Scholke with this idea whether or not there may be an opportunity to pursue something like this through the Historical Society. And he expressed that this is something that's actually been sought for a number of years, but the funding component of it, making it a viable project, has been challenging. The staff hours and finances required were difficult to procure. And so we started working on a plan. We met several times last year, and by October of last year, we had partners involved in the community that got us in touch with the Roger Dell Trust. And thanks to a generous donation by the Trust, in October, by January of this year, we began the background research and writing into this project to determine what would a history of Fergus Falls look like? What does that mean? We had a high-level concept, but specifically, what would we be achieving by writing this book? Last month, I completed a 43-page outline for this project, tentatively titled Founding Fergus Falls, A History. It describes 15 chapters in detail. Chapter by chapter, we know the names, we know the content. We know where we need to go to get this information, and we believe that we have a very engaging story to tell. And we also believe that now is the right time to tell that story. In fact, a product like this hasn't been attempted since 1972, when volunteer staff created the Centennial, marking the 100th anniversary of the founding of the city in 1972. But prior to that, the last time that this service has been professionally contracted was 1935, nearly 100 years ago at this point. And that work by Baker is a fantastic history, but interestingly enough, just 16 years after the cyclone, the anniversary of which we celebrate, if that's the word for it, this year, 16 years after that event, Baker's history includes very little detail of the cyclone, a major component of this city's story. So we started last month fundraising for this project. We identified the total expenses. We determined what it would take to make this viable, and what we have concluded is that we need to find 20 sponsors in the community that are willing to come in with a $2,500 donation to make this project viable. We have 10 of those commitments already, and we believe that City Hall may be an excellent partner for that. I can talk a great deal more in depth as to what the content of this project is like, if it's of interest to the council, but at this time, if I could, I'd open it up to any questions from the council.
Thank you, R.C. I'll just make one comment. Having had the opportunity to read that 43-page draft, I will say that it's going to be a very high-quality publication. There's no doubt in my mind that you're a very good writer and researcher, and I'm sure any of you would like to read that. R.C. would be more than happy to allow you to, but it's very well done.
Thank you, sir.
Work so far. Questions of the council?
Your name's going to be in it?
No. But Bill, Andrew?
Should I address the funding side of that?
I was just gonna ask Bill.
Legality?
Sure.
I know he can find $2,500.
And we can do that. And the question even before that is that we have researched is, can the city do such a thing? Because typically, and so that we're all well aware, cities cannot make contributions to projects or whatnot. However, in this instance, there is a Minnesota statute, 471.929, that allows us to support a project, commemorating this history. We are also allowed to support historical societies, which we do. That's part of our annual budget. So this fits in with that as well, too. So legally, in my opinion, we can do it unless Rolf tells me different. But
And I don't. And it's a good education opportunity for the council is that, we oftentimes do get requests for donations, but we gotta have a statutory basis to allow for a donation of this kind. And there's all sorts of good intended donation requests that could come before the city, but, we have to be able to point to a statute that says that we can do it, and this is definitely within
Your
our
Honor.
purview.
I'm just going to real quickly correct, Bill mentioned the wrong statute, so if anybody's looking it up.
what did I say?
It's on parking ordinances.
Bill said 471.929, it's 471.93. He's just looking at the wrong part of the screen.
Oh, I looked too high. I was down there.
I noticed that.
I'm actually looking at it here, but
If you're looking
Thank
at
you,
the
Andrew.
It's 471.93, that gives us the ability to do that.
very good. I was looking at the prior to. Long story short, we do have the legal authority,
The
so.
second part of that question Jim was asking is, I believe is where you were going with that, right, Jim?
Yeah, so from the actual funding source side of it, if we do that, if you choose to do that, I would say we would take it out of our community development budget. As you know, we have a vacant position right there. Some of that is already spoken for, but we could find 2,500 in that area.
Is,
And you should realize this is not if
This will be published by the Otter Tail County Historical Society, so all proceeds will go to the Historical Society from the book sales. We're contracting with Ryan Drews to be the research and writer of
And if that is the case, I would make the motion that we do a sponsorship of $2,500 for this publication.
Resolution?
Resolution.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Brent. Is chapter number 1 still available for a sponsorship?
I believe it is.
Oh, good. That should be the city of Fergus Falls.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions of Mr. Hughes?
Yeah, the history of pizza in Fergus Falls, perhaps.
What's that?
The history of pizza in Fergus Falls, perhaps.
Was the county doing anything else around kind of this celebration this year that they would need any help on? You know, in terms of kind of, you know, the cyclone?
The county contributed significantly last year for the 150th anniversary of Otter Tail County. This is specifically
For the city? And then are you doing anything on the cyclone?
Yes. We'll
Would-
talk about that later.
Oh,
A
okay.
lot, yes. I mean, I would like to address that, not now, but as we get closer.
Okay, right.
We have about less than 2 months.
It's coming back.
All right. Any other questions? Scott?
As you presented it, you were looking for 20 sponsors at $2,500 each, so it doesn't sound like there's levels, you know, the gold, silver, platinum, whatever. But if there were an option for the city of Fergus Falls to be the platinum level contributor, I would really support that. So I don't know if we go for a double portion or something greater than 2,500 in some way. I would support doing something even more than 2,500 if that option existed.
You picked a good night to come in front of the council.
The option that certainly exists on our end.
Would you take 20? Would you take 2,501?
Resolution for 20, and you did identify one level of sponsorship after
Yes,
consideration.
sir. Do you mind if I speak to that real quick?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So we have structured a sponsorship program for this project, and maybe it's more relevant in dealing with individual sponsors, family sponsors, business sponsors, but I'll mention it to the council as well, and some of you are aware of this already. But as part of our sponsorship program, everyone who contributes at that one level, that $2,500 level, will be receiving an individualized autographed copy of the book upon publication, which is expected next year. Also, a plaque is being commissioned by the Historical Society that will be placed in the E.T. Barnard Library at the museum to recognize all project sponsors, to include City Hall.
So how much more would we have to donate to get one in the public library? And
That's a
one
very
for
good question
Ben's
for Aaron
desk
Smith.
in his office.
Should call for the motion. I think there's a couple of questions. I mean, we got a motion on the floor already.
Resolution on the floor. Thank you. Roll call, please.
Yes.
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 That resolution is approved. Thank you, Art.
Thank you and good
Thank
luck.
you, ladies and gentlemen.
Final item on the agenda is Otter Tail Power River projects, and I believe this has been brought forward by Scott Kwame. Scott?
The Otter Tail Power has been dealing with the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for the last 4 years or so, as they've been looking to relicense their hydro dams along the river through the city of Fergus Falls. And I've been attending the meetings and getting all of the stuff in the mail that they send out from time to time regarding their work on this. Just got signed up with it and attended the meetings when they first got started 4 years ago because it interested me, and then now it really ties into a lot of the things that we're talking about. At last week's meeting, which was all of the schedule of this whole FERC thing is all dictated essentially. It's a federal deal, and things have to happen along a certain calendar. And so one of the reporting steps happened last week, and they had a meeting. And at that meeting, the DNR was there, a couple of their people in particular, Sean Dene and Eric Anthonyson. And I don't think I quite said their names right. But anyway, Sean and Eric both were there.
Johnson, yep.
And they had a lot of questions and a lot of input, and actually some very timely and proper things to throw into the discussion, you might say. There were some very critical comments made as well, as far as how that most recent report had been presented, some of the details that were in there that didn't seem to be quite right, you know, where there were some factual things that were either left out or weren't quite right regarding the portages at the rivers, the fish passage, the kind of research that had been done and how it was done, whether it was a desktop survey or whether it was actually people going out there and counting and measuring things or not. There were quite a lot of questions raised as far as that goes. But the one point that I wanted to make tonight, and what will lead to the question that I'd like us to consider, is there appears to be a real opportunity here for the city of Fergus Falls, working with Otter Tail Power, to get some money for the Riverwalk and the various work that we'd like to see done on the downtown riverfront area. We're working on this amphitheater project, for example, and the bridge and the things that are connecting in there. But that's all within the scope of this range of projects that Otter Tail Power is working on. And if the city was engaged with them and asked the right kinds of questions, it sounds like we could probably get some money for some of these things that we'd like to see done. I don't know how in the world we would be able to address it tonight in this meeting, so I'm thinking that we ought to put this on the agenda for a work session or for our next committee of the whole meeting at least, to try and figure out how we're going to do this. The timing of it is kind of getting short. Now, as it turns out, the timing for the comment period, before this next report gets put together, the responses and the input have to be in by June. So we only have about a month or so to put together whatever comments or requests or whatever we might want to try and get into this next draft bit. And so I guess I'd like to see us get moving on it. I'm not necessarily at a point where I can say we need to assign this to so-and-so to do this, because I think we ought to talk about what we want that to be. But at this point, if we can at least get it on our radar, get it on our next committee meeting so that we can start to talk about how we want to address this, I think it'd be really important.
Thank you, Scott. I mean, I think it would be appropriate if we are going to discuss this at a committee meeting that we invite Otter Tail Power representatives to kind of walk us through the process of where they're at, because it's a long process, relicensing process. And there's many comment periods and there's many deadlines, and so just kind of let us know, and then we can have that conversation. Anthony, did you?
Scott, are you in kind of, just to be clear, are you saying that regardless of the outcome of kind of the relicensing of the dam, there's the potential that the DNR would fund some riverbank projects?
The DNR would like to see some projects, but the funding wouldn't come from the DNR specifically, as far as I understood it. I think the funding would come from Otter Tail Power.
Right.
So if it's a project that the DNR supports and that Otter Tail Power is able to work with the city on through our discussion of what we'd like it to be, you know, maybe they can kick in some money toward what it might be. A couple of specific things that we talked about, or that were talked about at that meeting last week, were the sewer pipe across the river at Union Avenue. There might be an opportunity for that as a part of a recreational water trail access requirement for this relicensing, that the DNR would be very interested in seeing that recreational access improved. And by asking Otter Tail Power to address that question, we could maybe look at getting some money to try and accomplish that. Another one was where the wastewater treatment plant is, the old one that's next to the Pisgah Dam. We already are in the process of looking at the removal of that. We've taken some steps toward that, as far as I remember, with public improvement to demolish the old tanks and things like that. That particular area would lend itself well to the construction of a portage, possibly a fish ramp, or whatever they call it.
Passage.
Fish passage, yep. And that area could then become access to the river, park area. It was a suggestion that was made that just looked like it's reasonable. We ought to maybe take a look at that. And if there was some funding, because of the way it ties into DNR's comments about access and trail usage and recreational opportunity and all that, well, I think it doesn't hurt to ask for the money. And if we can get it, great. It might help us do something.
Thanks, Scott.
Did you know if it's like grant money, loan money, like full coverage, or just you know that there's money available?
The DNR people did say something to the effect that there were pools they knew of that they could direct us to.
Okay.
And I think I can't explain it any better than that. But
Okay.
apparently, besides the Otter Tail Power pockets, there would be other places that we could go to that they would help us with.
Yeah, can I?
Yeah, please.
Your Honor, members, I'm hesitant to speak, I guess, to this without Otter Tail Power and others being present, like the mayor mentioned. But I would think, from my involvement in the process, and I was not at the meeting last week, it's been a little bit controversial in the sense that there's competing interests between the DNR and Otter Tail Power Company for obvious reasons, economics on one end and natural resources on the other end. And what they're ultimately going to have to do is going to be mandated or dictated to them by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So I think that we should invite them to the room before we proceed in having a conversation about what could or couldn't happen or how this process may play out, because I think there's differing viewpoints between those two parties who would interpret the conversation we're having in two extremely different ways. And I've sat in on some that have gotten rather controversial between those parties. And so I'd be hesitant to jump on to one side of that conversation without giving both parties the ability to talk about their positions and what they could see as a benefit to the city or from the city's involvement. We've strategically, I think, stayed at an arm's length from the relicensing process thus far. I'm not saying that we shouldn't get involved or we should get involved, but we've strategically done that knowing that there's competing interests, and I guess the city of Fergus Falls has to decide what their stake is in this. If they support the power company's position of keeping all the dams in place as the lowest cost option, or if they would support federal mandates that would dictate something different that would result in a different look on the river. So I don't want to say anything else until the parties are in the room, but we certainly could do that.
Let's invite them to the next, both DNR and Otter Tail Power to be at our next committee of the whole meeting, and we'll have that discussion. Is that fair with everyone?
That's great.
Sounds good. All right. Under miscellaneous announcements, city offices are closed for Memorial Day. It's coming up, that's a ways yet. Next city council meeting is May 20th. Committee of the whole is May 15th, and that's when we'll extend that invitation to discuss that further. Any other announcements?
I would add, though, I think it would only be fair that they both come to the same meeting.
Yeah,
if one has a conflict, then we should reschedule it to another day.
I wholeheartedly agree. Any other announcements? If not, we're adjourned.